dispute it. Let's go on, and let's talk about the fact of a little bit of Jewish history here, since that's kind of the focus. Jewish history is important, as we outlined in that first slide, and see if we can adjust this a little bit so you can see all of it. Jewish history allows us to see how God is going to, in essence, fulfill his covenant promises. So I'm going to run through basic Old Testament 101 and then through intertestamental history. All of these things, there's plenty of good material on a basic Bible college level that can fill in a lot of the gaps here. But this is mostly what is called the 450 silent years, the intertestamental period. In 539, Persia has defeated Babylon. Babylon is the third world power. They defeated the kingdom of Judea. Persia now defeats the Babylonians. Persians have a different policy toward those conquered people. They don't move them around, but they basically say you can go back to your homeland. Just be sure to send us our taxes every year, and you'll be okay. And so many people go back to Israel. However, even more stayed. You'll recognize the names of two of them. Mordecai and Esther chose to stay behind in Persia, and from there we get the book of Esther. So the Jewish people who had straggled back to Israel, they were not well-to-do. They had difficulty in getting things back on track. But finally, the Second Temple is rebuilt in Jerusalem, and everyone thought, well, this is going to bring the kingdom. Problem is, it did not. And there was a general malaise at the building of the Second Temple, because the old people who had seen the First Temple as children, when they looked at the Second Temple, they wept, because it was a mere shadow of Solomon's temple. And so Jewish history is going along here. The next great world power are the Greeks. Alexander the Great conquers in 322. He conquers the known Western world. He is foretold in Daniel chapter 8. That's a whole other study, a complex study. And what Alexander and his successors, his four successors, do is they divide up the Western world into four pieces. And Israel was right in the middle of two of the generals, so they were always fought over. But he would spread Hellenism. Alexander the Great was a devotee of the Greek gods and goddesses, of all those beautiful statues, and he and his successors sought to spread Hellenism. Hellenism is simply the culture of pagan Greece, with its idols and idolatry and togas and whatever else Greek culture had. And so they sought to spread this to the Jewish people. However, the Jewish people were worshippers of the God of creation, a God who could not be represented by a statue. And so there was a conflict here. There was a clash of cultures. And the Jewish people were being urged to remain faithful, and yet Hellenism was very alluring and was successful in swaying a number of young people away to that. And so as that progressed and got worse and worse, there was a revolt of the Maccabees. There was a recognition that if we don't do something now to halt this, they're going to take over our temple. They're going to sacrifice to idols in our own temple. And so the Maccabees arise, and these are five faithful brothers who sought to stop the Hellenization. And this is the story of Hanukkah, the story of how the Maccabees stopped that. But in the midst of this, still Jewish people are, for the most part, writing and doing commerce in Greek, and that is the reason for, up there you see the translation of the Old Testament into Greek, the Septuagint, which was done by 70 rabbis. And so while the Jewish people are still worshiping the God of Israel, they are firmly involved in an increasingly Greek world. They fight against that. There's the Maccabean revolt. And ultimately, they are able to take over and win their freedom back for a short period of time. It did not last long, however, because in the year 63 BC, in the midst of a Jewish civil war, and by the way, that Jewish civil war was between a brother and sister and their representative armies, Jewish brother and sister. The Rome was able to exploit that Jewish civil war, were able to come in ostensibly as peacemakers, but after a while they said, no, we're going to be staying and we're going to take over. Thus we have this sixth world power, the Romans there, that are taking over and once again occupying the Jewish land. The land of Israel, after 586, would suffer a whole series of occupations by foreign invaders, and even today we see the remnant of that with the Muslim invasion from Saudi Arabia. We're seeing the tail end of that. That there are many places in the Middle East that are still occupied by their descendants. So these are conflicts of biblical proportions. While they may fill our newsfeed, they all have their roots in scripture conflicts. And so Rome is now occupying the land of Israel. However, Rome was a far-flung empire, and it was impossible to rule all parts of their empire equally. And so they tended to set up local proxies. They tended to set up individuals whom they could control, who seemed to be part of the local population. And such an individual was the family of Herod Antipas. The Antipas family were recent converts to Judaism. They were not ethnically Jewish. They were not from that background. Instead, they were Idumean. And they really had no emotional feeling for Jewish things. They were converts of convenience. The Romans saw that. The Romans were able to exploit them, pay them handsomely in order to keep the peace and to give the illusion that somehow the land of Israel had its own king in the person of Herod. Well, as soon as we mention Herod, the very famous birth of Messiah Yeshua, Messiah Jesus, Yeshua, of course, is his Hebrew name. That comes up because Herod tried to have all the Jewish male babies killed because he wanted to be the only king of the Jews in his own imagination. And so this is how Jewish history comes to interact with even our New Testament understanding. In this slide 3, I believe, 4, slide 4 talks about the revolt against Rome and the parting of the ways. There is increased harshness of Roman rule, both pressure that was religious, with Jewish religious practices, with biblical practices, with scripture practices, increasingly forbidden or under pressure from Rome. Rome wanted to ultimately assimilate the Jews and cause them to adopt Roman ways. And in the midst of that, there were increased taxes, and it was not a good situation. There was increased resentment against Rome. Young Jewish men were looking at Rome and seeing cracks in the face, and they were seeing fissures and weaknesses in the Roman occupation, and they were dreaming of independence. They were thinking back to the good old days of David and Solomon and the kingdom that ruled over all of the Middle East at that point. So there were these dreams of independence. The New Testament is now coming to a close. The final books in the New Testament are being written. And at this point, the Jewish community of believers in Jesus, i.e. the early church, there in the land of Israel, they're still considered to be a branch of Judaism. This is not my view. This is the view of accredited historians, Jewish, evangelical, Roman Catholic, secular, no matter who you go to. It's well understood that there had not yet been a parting of the ways between the Jewish believers in Jesus and the mainstream Jewish community. But that was coming. And so in 66, there are Jewish zealots who dream of independence. They attack the Roman fortress at Jerusalem. That fortress is not very heavily guarded, and so this zealot band of guerrillas was able to overpower and dispatch the Roman garrison there. But it wasn't long until the main Roman occupation there at Caesarea heard of this, and they sent word back to Rome to send reinforcements. So it was understood that even though they had defeated that small garrison, Rome was going to send reinforcements, and within a few months there would be gigantic Roman armies and weapons of war, modern weapons of war, catapults and all sorts of things arriving by ship from Rome into Caesarea on the coast, and from there up to Jerusalem. And so as a result, the leaders of the revolt called for all Jews to enter Jerusalem to help to defend the city and turn back the Romans. Initially, according to the British Jewish historian Hugh Schoenfeld, who was an interesting character in himself when he wrote history, later he changed his views and apostatized and became a writer of fiction. But in his early years, he was a serious historian. And writing in the 1930s, Hugh Schoenfeld spoke about the fact that the early Jewish believers in Jesus were certainly part of the defense of Jerusalem against these pagan Romans. That is his view. But when the believers recognized that what Jesus had predicted was about to come true, Jesus said, when you see the city surrounded by armies, know that its time is near, therefore flee to the mountains. Well, how can you flee if the city is surrounded? Well, there's a certain point at which the Romans surrounded the city, met much stiffer opposition, realized they had to get resupplied. They fell back to the coast to resupply, and so the city was unguarded for about 3 to 4 months. The Jewish believers took that opportunity to flee the city as per the instruction of Messiah in Luke chapter 21. As they left, people were yelling and screaming and cursing at them, saying that they are traitors. The Romans were sure to come back, and they needed all the help that they could to defend the city. And so they accused them in Hebrew of a word called shmad. Shmad is to become a traitor, to betray something. And in the participle form, it's called meshumadim. They were the traitors. And so that would begin the break, the parting of the ways that would separate the Jewish believers in Jesus, the early church, and would separate them from traditional rabbinical Judaism. There were always theological separations. You see that in the New Testament. However, theological separations and differences among the Jewish people were legendary. The Pharisees and the Sadducees despised each other's theology, and they fought to the point where sometimes it was violent. And so the idea that these Jewish believers in Jesus had a different theology did not exclude them from the Jewish community, because the Jewish community was used to seeing differences in theology. You have 2 Jews, you have 3 opinions. That's a common phrase, common saying in the Jewish community. However, this dispute was going to eventually get wider and wider. There were disputes among the Jewish factions as the Romans came back, and finally there was infighting among the Jewish factions, and Jerusalem fell to the Romans in the year 70 A.D., just as Jesus predicted. The temple was destroyed, and it was a catastrophe. 1 million Jewish people were killed during that time. It was a time of such destruction that it took 20 years for the Jewish leadership to pick itself up from the dust and to try to reform there in Judea. So one thing to recognize here is, because of the destruction of Jerusalem, one of the big Jewish factions, the Sadducees, in essence, came to its end. The Sadducees were temple-centric, and as temple-centric faction, when the temple was destroyed, they went down with the ship, whereas the Pharisees were a portable faith. The Pharisees started the whole idea of Judaism being portable, something that they had started back during the Babylonian captivity. And ultimately, when they coalesced as an organization, the Pharisees would spread out. And so there are 2 Jewish groups which survived the destruction of Jerusalem. One was the Pharisees, and we have documentation of that. And the second were the Messianic Jews, the Jewish believers in Jesus the Messiah, who actually physically located onto the other side of the Jordan River. We have documentary evidence for that as well. And so in 90 AD, the Pharisees recognized that the Romans were not going to change their mind. They weren't going to give Jerusalem back. And so they needed to make Judaism sort of permanently portable. It needs to be able to travel and be detached from the physical temple. In essence, the temple was the one place where sacrifice can be offered. Sacrifice for sin had to be offered at the temple. To do it anywhere else was totally against Torah, against the scripture. However, the Pharisees had come to the conclusion that since God allowed the temple to be destroyed, no longer did he require sacrifice. It's a convenient way of hitting a certain area on the side of the barn and then painting a target around it. They simply took what was and changed their theology to match what happened to be. We understand, as Jewish believers, I understand that the reason the temple was destroyed was because of the rejection by that generation of the messiahship of Yeshua, the messiahship of Jesus. They were watching his miracles, and yet they attributed those miracles to the Beelzebub. That's very clear in the text. And so the Pharisees, as you see in your notes there on the PowerPoint, they reorganized Judaism not around the rules and regulations of Scripture, but around the oral law. Oral law was an imagined set of instruction that God had whispered into Moses' ear when he was on Mount Sinai. So you had the Torah, the 5 books of Moses, with their 613 commandments, but you now also have the oral law. Originally it was transmitted orally. However, now it would be written down, and it would be a set of rules and regulations, thousands of rules and regulations, on how to keep the Torah. This is how they imagined it. For every rule in the Torah, there would be 10 rules in the Mishnah. The Mishnah is the oral law. 300 years later, there would be a compilation of commentaries on the Mishnah, and that would be called the Gemara, something I saw in my youth many times. And together, these two parts are called the Talmud. The Talmud is over 30 volumes, depending on the edition. It is like the Encyclopedia Britannica, for those who are of a certain age who remember the Encyclopedia Britannica. And so it is an ocean of learning. And that had become the basic guideline for Orthodox Judaism for many years. To be clear, today there are videos circulating on YouTube which imagine the Talmud to be full of anti-Christian rhetoric. Friends, that is simply nonsense. I've read the portions. There are maybe 30 short verses that can even possibly be construed as being any sort of reference. The Talmud has millions of words, and there may be 30 short passages which might have anything to do, and really only around 7 or 8 of them can have any sort of validity. And so no, the Talmud is mostly a set of rules and regulations, since Orthodox Jews don't mix meat and dairy. There's all kinds of rules and regulations in the Gemara, thousands of them, regarding what to do and how to keep your dishes separate. And so the Talmud comes to life here. In 132 of the Common Era, the Bar Kokhba revolt was the second revolt against Rome. Once again, the Jewish believers were initially involved. That seems to be the evidence. However, ultimately, when Bar Kokhba, this Jewish general, when he was proclaimed to be the Messiah, the Jewish believers had to leave. They could not fight under that false banner. And finally, that was the final parting of the ways. The Jewish believers in Jesus were now expelled from the synagogue, and you start to see in Jewish writings clear statements that those who believe in Yeshua are to be expelled from the synagogue. They are called, in the Hebrew text, they're called the Menim. The Menim is a Hebrew word for sectarians, and that is the euphemism by which Jewish believers are called in the Talmud. And there is a final separation of the ways at that point. Going on here in our outline.